Hello, and welcome to part 3 of our Nexus Water, Energy, Food speaker series. This series is hosted by the following Johns Hopkins University Advanced Academic Programs: Environmental Sciences and Policy, Energy Policy and Climate, and Geographic Information Systems. My name is Dr. Cassandra Hansen. I'm the Program Coordinator for Environmental Sciences and Policy and GIS. I am so pleased to introduce today's speaker, Davies O'Shea. She's the Executive Director and founder of Farmers Conservation Alliance. She has extensive background in conservation, renewable energy, and irrigation projects, and is the catalyst behind the growth and development of the FCA. Her leadership guided not only the creation of the Irrigation Modernization Program in the Western states, but also most recently the installation of the nation's largest horizontal fish screen. The screen, known as the 50th Farmers Screen installed, was a project in partnership with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation at Derby Dam in the state of Nevada, supporting the recovery of the threatened Lahontan Cutthroat Trout. So please virtually put your hands together and welcome our guest speaker, Davies O'Shea.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to be here with you all and to join in on your conversation about the food, water, energy nexus. I really do believe this is one of the most important conversations for our nation and for the world to be having right now. There's an enormous opportunity and endless pathways for innovation when we think about the role of food security, of energy generation and conservation, and our nation's water systems. And whether you're talking about agriculture and dynamic pipelines, or fires in the West, or grid failure in Texas, or drinking water in Flint and rebuilding after the southern hurricanes, today, we have the power, the knowledge, and the ability to build better systems using current technologies, and yet at the same time, setting the stage to prepare for future innovations. By working together, we can accelerate the building and rebuilding of our communities in a way that allows for food, energy, water security, and ultimately, the security and well-being of our communities. The reason I feel so confident in this future is because I spend day in and day out learning, thinking about, implementing, and being inspired by the opportunities of modernization for our nation's infrastructure. As you will see in this presentation today, modernizing irrigation or water delivery infrastructure is one of the greatest opportunities in the West for agricultural and food security, for environmental restoration and conservation efforts, for energy generation and conservation. And of course, all of this leads to rural economic and community resiliency. As I go through this presentation today, I want you to not only think about the opportunities for irrigated water systems, and I do want you to think about those because we'd love to hear your thoughts about that. But I'd also like you to think about how these practices lend itself to other dimensions of the food, energy, water nexus and the building and rebuilding of our nation's infrastructure. Okay, so with all that said, let's get to it. So to start, I'm going to give a quick history of FCA because I think with this background, it'll give you the context for the solutions and the strategies that we're implementing today. FCA began in 2005 because of the Farmers Irrigation District and their invention of the farmer screen, which is a horizontal fish screen technology. Essentially, FID was struggling with a very common issue in Western agriculture. How do you divert water into your irrigation system without trapping debris or harming fish? Now, I know we have people here from all over the country and the world, and many people are not familiar with how Western agriculture works. So I thought I would start off with a review of some of the basic elements of Western agriculture. So essentially in Western United States, in order to grow food, because typically we don't get rain all summer, you have to divert water from a river or lake through a series of canals and usually through some more pipes and sprinklers that take the water from the river or lake out to the farm or ranch. Well, at the point of diversion, where the water is leaving the river and going into the canal, people often install a fish screen, or as they used to be called, debris screens, to keep the fish, sticks, and leaves out of the canal and in the river, and then keep the clean water moving from the canals out to the farm. Therefore, the fish screens, when you put in a fish screen, you can keep the fish and endangered species in the river, yet at the same time, you can work on lowering operation and maintenance costs for the district by keeping all of the animals and sticks out of the system. Now, I want to put a pin in this part of the conversation because this is going to be a theme you're going to hear throughout this conversation is these win-win solutions. Okay, so now in FID's case, at this point of diversion, they had a fish screen, but it didn't work very well. And the result of that, they were spending $150,000 a year in operation and maintenance costs. This is a tiny little district, $150,000 a year. And on top of that, they were still getting 250,000 fish in their system. Again, tiny little district. A district that's pulling water from one of the rivers that has the highest concentration of endangered species in our region. And then when they're pulling that water through the canal on its way to the farms, this is a big piece of it. They were one of the first districts to be able to have in-conduit hydropower. So first the water is going through a hydro system and then out to the farm. And so every time their fish screen was clogged, not only did the water not get to the farmers, and it was costing a lot of money and lots of fish are getting in the system, it wasn't running through the hydro facility, which means they weren't generating the revenue they needed to help continue modernizing their system. So you can see why a well-running system benefits the farmer, it benefits the fish, it produces renewable energy, and benefits rural communities. Okay, back to the story. So in 1996, a big flood came through. It ripped out the very infrastructure you're looking at right here. It forced FID to have to rebuild everything. And of course, FID did not want to build the same system that wasn't working for them. So they went to the local tribes, the agencies, nonprofits, and they asked for their support in developing a fish screen that would work for all. 10 years, $2.5 million, and with the mantra, let fish be our guide, they invented the farmer screen. The farmer screen is a horizontal fish screen. It has dramatically reduced FID's operation and maintenance cost, and in 7 different studies is proved to have provided optimal fish protection. To honor the collaborative partnerships that made the screen possible and to help it work so well, they patent the technology. We formed FCA, which is a nonprofit, and they licensed the screen to us under the condition that we take the screen to market, sell as many screens as possible, and then use our profits to invest in other people and solutions that benefit agriculture, the environment, and our communities. So off to the races we went. Now, to give you a sense of need out there and how much opportunity there is for things like the farmer screen, here's the stats. There are more than 1 million diversions in the Western United States. 80% of these diversions are for agriculture. Most of the systems, they're 75 to 100 years old. They're leaking 30 to 60% of their diverted water. On top of that, moving water through many of these canals requires numerous amounts of energy to pump the water. And then there's the extreme operation and maintenance issues and costs that the landowners and the irrigators have to manage. Then back to where we began, in Oregon alone, we have 70,000 diversions. A study 10 years ago estimated that more than 75% of these diversions do not have any type of screen at the diversion. So when you think about the potential and the benefits for modernizing Western irrigation systems, it's really one of the most extraordinary things you can do for the agriculture, the environment, for communities. It is a real win-win-win in fixing these systems. Of course, when you're thinking about the benefits, we're not just talking about fish, right? We're looking at agricultural security and reliability. We're thinking about improved river flows due to reduced withdrawals, water quality benefits by managing runoff, eliminating passage barriers by opening up miles of river for safe passage, habit corridors for pollinators and other species, energy generation, economic development, food security. We're looking at ways that we can create dynamic systems to manage surface versus groundwater. And then looking forward, we're looking at other ways to build into these systems. Could we co-locate fiber optics and transmission lines with these right-of-ways, with these canals that are running through the West? At FID, in addition to the fish and hydropower, as they've continued to modernize, they're now using 50% less water. And at the same time, they're seeing the production and profitability of their farmers continue to go up. Just to put an extra point on this, because I think it's sometimes so hard to believe how old this infrastructure is. Here's a photo of Colin. He's one of the irrigation district managers that we work with. He is literally standing on an irrigation canal built of wood. Literally built of wood, as you can see in the picture. There's many of these canals. Can you imagine what it would be like to maintain a system moving water in a canal of wood? When it's full of water, it looks like a sprinkler system with water shooting out everywhere. I'll talk more about these canals in a bit. So let's fast forward since OShea was created, 16 years. We now have 51 screens installed in 8 states, including the one that was mentioned earlier. It's a $34 million 600 CFS screen we just built at the Derby Dam on the Truckee River, which is right outside of Reno. And what is really incredible about this project, Derby Dam was one of the first Bureau of Reclamation projects that they built, one of the first dams that went into the ground. It was built in the early 1900s. And as it was built, it blocked fish passage, and it led to what was believed to be the extinction of the Lahontan Cutthroat Trout. So a handful of years ago, another fish was identified as having the same DNA as the LCT, and they realized that they had found a match of the fish and that the fish wasn't extinct. So a number of the regional tribes and U.S. Fish and Wildlife worked together and spent many years rebuilding an LCT population. And over the last few years, we've worked with Bureau of Reclamation to install a fish screen at the Derby Dam site to allow the LCT to travel again from Lake Tahoe to Pyramid Lake and back again. This summer, for the first time in over 100 years, the LCT will be making this journey. It is such an exciting project to be a part of. But over the years, as we worked on these fish screens, we started learning about other needs of farmers and ranchers and irrigators, especially when it came to modernization and the project planning required to see these projects into implementation. For example, someone wants to put in a fish screen. They spend a handful of years raising money for the project. They go in to install the screen, only to realize they need to install a new pipeline to run to the screen. Remember, these are 100-year-old systems. So sometimes when you change one piece and start messing with it, it turns out you got to change the other pieces. Well, guess what? That pipeline runs through a person's property who doesn't want a new pipeline on it. And suddenly the project is stalled. Yet on the other hand, we have a number of farmers come to us. They've been quoted that they need 15 million, 50 million, hundreds of $1 millions to fix their system. And at the same time, they're getting sued over water issues. And yet the system costs so much to change. And even though they want to change their system, and even though it would benefit them to change the system, how does a group of farmers like the ones in the screen right now, 19 families makes up this district, to fix their system, $17 million? How does 19 families come up with $17 million? That's the question. So often they don't, right? An example I often use is, what if your house in your neighborhood and you found out that the water system was killing fish and that every house in the neighborhood needed to pay $1 million to fix the water system or you lose your water? Sounds crazy, right? This is what's happening in ag all the time. So before I leave this, I just want to point out another wooden canal running behind them. We kept having the same conversation over and over again. So when we went to the various entities who were also trying to help ag to understand what they're doing and how they're working with ag and helping modernize these systems, and we went to funders who were willing to fund these projects, we found out that they weren't getting many applications, that often there weren't enough projects coming into the programs to even warrant having a national or a federal program because there were so few shovel-ready projects getting staged up. Or maybe not even shovel-ready, is that people didn't have the resources for project development. And what we realized was critical to the success of these projects was having someone in a central role that could support farmers and ranchers and irrigators in a path to modernize their system. When you think about it, modernizing often falls to the water district or the landowner. And while they're really good at moving water and dealing with multiple conditions and managing the land, generally they don't have the capacity or resources to raise millions, if not billions of dollars to modernize their system. Think about what it takes to do that. Think about what it takes to modernize an irrigation system. Now, on top of farming and ranching and dealing with storms and floods and all these other pieces, people need to know how to develop a project plan, how to raise capital, How do you manage the politics? How do you engage and negotiate with stakeholders? Tell your story, write the applications, fill out the permits. The list is endless. And this is what small groups of landowners are having to do in order to be able to modernize. And the reality is modernization was very difficult and rarely was happening. One of the partners we kept having this conversation with was Energy Trust of Oregon, who, even though they were funding a significant portion of new project development, they had very few projects moving forward. Over the years, we kept talking with Energy Trust about how to accelerate renewable energy and modernization projects. And what we realized is that in order for the projects to move forward, we needed someone who could help landowners and irrigators in that pre-development phase. Energy Trust agreed to provide FCA with the pre-development capital essential to build out this concept and model and to support irrigation districts and their path of modernization and renewable energy. And this is what we now call our Irrigation Modernization Program. We launched it 7 years ago with the idea of being that we could work with irrigation districts or groups of irrigators to help them plan out, raise the money, and implement irrigation modernization projects. We were fortunate with Energy Trust investment because it allowed us to create the necessary scale to develop the systems and practices and transfers of lessons learned to support these irrigation districts. It also allowed us to be able to move to a national level to be able to showcase the potential of infrastructure in irrigation modernization projects at scale to advocate for funding and support of these projects. A few years into the program, and we started developing a list of shovel-ready projects. We partnered with Natural Resource Conservation Service, one of our federal agencies, to develop watershed plans to help fund these mainline infrastructure projects. And now to date, FCA is working with 30 irrigation district communities to support the modernization of their systems. We're working with 55% of irrigated agriculture in the state of Oregon. And we've replicated our program to include irrigation systems in Montana, Nevada, and Northern California. In addition, for the first 7 districts into our program, we were part of a team that helped raise $150 million to go to modernization projects in the Deschutes Basin. These projects, which are in construction now, will install hundreds of thousands of feet of pipe and put more than 200 CFS back in stream in the Deschutes River for critical and endangered species. And we're going to replace a number of those wooden canals that you saw earlier today. Of course, with funding like this, you can imagine what it's doing for the local community and for jobs throughout Central Oregon at such a critical time. In this photo, you can see Senator Merkley, as well as former NRCS Chief Lohr and the Irrigation District Manager cutting the ribbon to start the project, to start one of these great projects. Looking forward at some of our early projects, we're working to raise $1 billion within the next 10 years. We see a time in our future where, with just a few districts that we have staged for implementation, we'll have more than 600 CFS secured in stream proficient habitat. We can help set up those dynamic systems to manage surface versus groundwater. We can support more than 350 miles of streams being improved. We can conserve 770,000 megawatt hours of energy. We're looking at 40 megawatts of renewable carbon-free energy generating, and the result of that will be supporting more than 25,000 jobs. But the reason we're seeing these projects happen is because of the collaborative environment, because of the number of people that are coming together and thinking about the projects and the opportunities for the win-win nature and the multi-benefits of this project. And while I can tell you about the work we do and the impact, it is not the same as seeing it for yourself. So I'd love to take you all on a tour of one of our systems in Oregon or the other states. Here's a quick video that talks a bit about some of the things I've already talked about today, but shows you some of the opportunities of the landscape.
I never imagined today, 20 years ago.
We have 85% of surface water traveling through a system that's 75 to 100 years old. Modernizing these irrigation systems is one of the greatest opportunities of our generation.
Thanks to Senator Merkley and NRCS and all our partners, we're going to have the horsepower to really crank this up. We now have the ability to take this turbine and put that in front of the clay valve and then make electricity.
Irrigation modernization is really just the radical idea of delivering water in a pipe. As soon as you start doing that, it completely changes the dynamics on these systems.
We had the opportunity to do the first watershed plan in quite a few years. FCA brought in about 20 people to write the plan in record time. The senator came along and get us the opportunity to expand production by fourfold.
We have $25 million. I'm going to do everything I can to sustain it and help the replumbing of irrigation here in Central Oregon.
3, 2, 1.
We need to have more celebrations in agriculture and things like this. And so what a great opportunity it is to be here. This is a tremendous display of what true collaboration is. There's other folks around the country that are watching very closely to see the good work that's been done, and I look forward to seeing how these partnerships can continue.
It's so funny as I look at the video, it makes me think I have to qualify to say that was taken pre-COVID, back when we weren't wearing masks all the time and everywhere. But moving on. So now we're thinking more just about how we modernize these canals, and whether it's pipe or lining, or what are those next pieces? And we're also thinking a lot about how do we raise more funds for these projects beyond just state and federal funds? How do we increase the value of these projects for the community overall? We've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we think differently about these corridors, the million diversions, the web of these water corridors moving throughout the West. If we're going to put $1 billion, $10 billion, $100 billion in the ground, what else can we do? And what else do our communities need? And how can we make our investments more impactful? Of course, one of the big pressures in the West is fire. So how can we build these systems and include water recharging infrastructure to help support firefighting, especially in rural areas and out in the forest, where we can have recharging right there, pressurized water? Would be great. We're looking at ways we can increase building pollinator corridors and more habitat as we have these corridors moving throughout the West. And then now we're really looking at a space of, could we co-locate fiber optic and transmission lines and power lines along the way of these water canals? After doing some research, we quickly learned that typically installing power and fiber optic lines costs about $2 million a mile. But when you co-locate power and fiber optic lines with the irrigation canals, you're looking at a cost of about $100,000 a mile. I mean, it's such a big difference. And do the canals always go where we need them? Well, no, but we do sometimes, and can be a part of moving these projects forward. As you see in this photo, we've started running conduit in our projects just to start staging up those opportunities, so that as we learn more, we can more cost effectively run the power lines or the fiber optic lines. Okay, so what if we do build all of our systems now with the co-location of fiber optic and power? What could we do? Could we provide broadband access in rural areas where it's been cost prohibitive? Absolutely. We're already seeing that happen. Could you expand cell phone coverage in places where there's no service? Again, absolutely. And it is so essential. We have many places out here in the West where we have no cell service. Even, in a place we're doing this project right here is on the way to one of the most popular ski resorts in Oregon. There's no cell phone coverage, even though it's one of the highest places to get into an accident. Okay, could you support remote charging stations for cars and farming equipment in rural areas where, again, it's been cost prohibitive? Yes and yes. Could you tap into that renewable energy being created by the district to support those projects? Yes, you get the idea. And yet there's so much opportunity when you build this foundation of a dynamic water system that could include power and fiber optic lines. And could you provide backup power generation or fire protection? I mean, there's so many of these elements. And then back to our original goal, could you use all of these other pieces to create an additional revenue source for the farmers to help pay for this infrastructure in the first place? This is where we're at right now. Now, I've just spent all this time talking about water infrastructure in the West and the opportunities of building dynamic water systems, but I'm also thinking about dynamic infrastructure and thinking about ways that we go beyond just agriculture, the environment, renewable energy, firefighting, At the core of this story is what are the opportunities when we start looking at infrastructure from another lens? In our town of Oregon, we just went through the largest gas outage in Northwest Natural's history. We were without gas, and therefore in many homes that was heating, cooking, hot water for more than a week. In Portland, as we speak, they're still managing their largest power outage in the Northwest in the last 50 years. In Texas, we hear the stories of grid failures and families struggling to keep warm. This story is so commonplace. We're hearing it all the time now. There's just so many of these. Flint, Michigan, and their drinking water, which is not just in Flint, all over our country. The hurricanes in the South, and every time our infrastructure gets knocked down in the South, and how do we approach rebuilding? California had the largest wildfires in history. How many stories have you heard lately where you're thinking about a breakdown of infrastructure or the need for modernized infrastructure? And of course, these systems are important for food and energy and water nexus that we've been talking about. But as I hear these projects and I see examples, I'm seeing opportunities all over the place. I'm seeing leadership from every direction of people who are trying to rethink this movement of modernization. And whether it's an innovation in how we collect our data, or in irrigation, or even things as simple as an idea I heard last week, where municipalities are starting to advocate that in all new parking lots, you have them built with empty conduit to each parking spot, so that charging stations or whatever the right technology is later can be put in place more cost efficiently. This simple action of placing empty conduit pipe, which is pennies on the dollar for many of these projects, can support the acceleration of use of electric vehicles, regardless of where the new technologies lead us. It's so amazing when you start thinking about infrastructure and what it can enable. There's just so much opportunity and innovation happening all over the place. But in the end, and why I'm so excited to be here today, is we need you. We need all of your creativity and your thinking and your experiences and your history and all your different lessons learned to think about infrastructure and what those opportunities are, because we need help in building and rebuilding this infrastructure in a way that creates a foundation for all of our communities to thrive, regardless if we're rural or urban, east or west. It doesn't matter. There's an opportunity in every single community. So I want to thank you for having me here today. I'd love to hear your questions. And most importantly, I'd love to hear your thoughts or ideas about modern infrastructure and where there's other opportunities that we could be growing and learning. Also on this slide, we put a web link for a few more stories about the work that we're doing and the modernization that we're doing and the places that we're working with. Thank you again. I'm really grateful to be here.
Thank you, Julie. Let's everyone give her a round of applause. Comments are coming in, truly inspirational. Thank you so much. Great presentation. I would like to open this time up now for the community to ask questions. So go ahead and feel free to post your questions. Some questions that were coming in during the presentation, Julie. You talked a little bit about the Oregon Energy Trust, but could you talk a little bit more about where does the funding come from to fix these systems for the irrigation districts? Are they state and federal grants, or what's the process there?
It's a mixture of funds. So we are using state funds as well as federal dollars. We're also working on loans with the districts. Renewable energy comes up because obviously we want to have renewable energy projects, but it also is a great source of revenue and can allow districts to do long-term low interest loans and help pay that back through time. Ecosystem services is another one. And as we see that market maturing, again, I'd love to advocate for people being in ecosystem services and building out those markets, because it really does help accelerate these projects. A number of the districts in Central Oregon, while they did get state and federal funds, are doing long-term loans, and they're doing water transaction sales, which we have here in Oregon, to help cover the cost of those long-term loans. So there is a variety of ways that we're looking at funding. I also mentioned the fiber optic and transmission lines. We're seeing places where, you know, cell phone towers lease for several $100,000 a year. And if you have the fiber optic running to it, does that allow you to put in a cell phone tower to an area that doesn't get cell phone service, but creates the earned revenue to help offset the loan for a district to be able to modernize their systems. So we're looking at all of those different elements.
Excellent, thank you. Another question that came in with the environmental negativities of hydroelectricity, a popular talking point these days. Are these fish screens or runaround applicable to hydroelectric dams with the same effect of saving the ecosystem, sediment, et cetera? Can you talk a little bit about that?
In hydro, there's, there is the classic dam-based hydropower, right? And there's dams throughout the West, just like where we built our fish screen around Derby Dam to create passage. The hydropower that we are looking at is a little bit different. It's in conduit hydro. So we're really looking at hydropower where the water's already been screened or being used for something else. So it's out of the system. We're not looking at building dams or passage barriers. And if we were thinking about that initial photo with FID early on, where the water kind of separated into a separate canal, that's what we're really looking at. Or that image that we had, the illustration of the farm, where water's moving out to the farm and on the way, it's going through the in-conduit plant. So it's a little bit different model than what traditional hydropower has been.
Excellent, thank you. A question that just came in what ways do you see the work being done by FCA to be replicatable by international agencies and governments from around the world? So what, from the international standpoint, how is your work in comparison?
Well, we spend a lot of time looking at different practices throughout the world where we're always learning as well. Israel's been a great leader in this. Australia has been a leader. And what's been great for us to see is that arc of where people have been putting projects in the ground and then learning from how that turned out in various water banks and, what piping happened 30 years ago and what pipe worked and didn't work. So we're constantly trying to learn from what other people are doing around the world. And I hope that same piece is similar here within FCA. We've had a number of people call us from different countries thinking about and strategizing around how to fix their systems. But really what we're trying to do is build out a toolbox that can be used locally to fit the right solution. So what works in the Deschutes Basin might be piping their canals, but in a place like Klamath Basin, those open canals may provide a lot of benefit for habitat and other elements of groundwater and whatnot. And so how do we build the right toolbox, whether it's funding, as we just talked about, or the applied side in the ground, to help think about how we modernize these systems and do it in a way that's right for that community. In the beginning, I talked about Farmers Irrigation District had a fish screen that didn't work well for them. And that was because traditionally there was about 6 screens that you could use throughout the Western United States that at least was approved by the government. When you have 1 million diversions, you put the wrong screen in and it's just as bad as no screen. Lots of fish are getting the system, fish were getting killed. And so it's about having the right solution and the right technology for that community. And so those exchange of ideas, we're really excited about that.
Excellent. Another question that came in about, the open canals and then enclosing them. What type of mitigation measures are you guys putting in place to, obviously there's a disruption within the natural ecosystem of riparian corridors, and how does that work in proposing mitigation and applying the mitigation process?
I think the big piece around that is it's figuring out what makes sense in that community. So when we go in to start working in a particular community, there is a history of people who have been working there for a really long time. They already have typically, in the Deschutes, for example, they've had multiple basin studies and groundwater studies and water studies. And often there's a suite of projects that people have been able to identify as being the right projects in that community. And that's where we really work with the various stakeholders, whether it's not just the district, but agencies and environmental nonprofits and tribes and different groups to figure out what is that right path and what does everyone agreed upon make sense for that community and that environment. And then in FCA's role, we really see ourselves as accelerating those projects that are already identified as the best projects there. We bring more pieces into that. So, someone might say, we want to pipe the system. We're pulling into the data. We're working with all the experts who make those decisions about the groundwater and the mitigation to help build up that project plan. And then, we can help support with the engineering, additional data needed, getting the funding and supporting the implementation. But generally that's dictated by the groups that have that direct community knowledge and are really the experts there and that we're coming in to support.
Excellent. So now this feeds into another question about the science that's involved in, the process of taking the water and putting it into piped irrigation canals. How does FCA pay for the science that's often needed to inform project design, et cetera? Is that part of the overall package application of the process?
Absolutely. We're doing tons of research to look at what's happening. We're also working with local universities and research institutions to be able to figure out what makes sense. And really, when I think about what it is we're doing, it's about building dynamic water systems, because the other element is, in a lot of these places, we are getting data for the first time. Many of the places we're working with, they don't even have digital maps yet. And so as we collect the information, we're going to learn a lot more. And we really think about our role is, how can we be a good steward of the opportunity? How do we build a dynamic water system? So today we may say, hey, it makes sense to pipe it. And tomorrow realize, you know what, you need to be able to have groundwater, or vice versa, or whatever it is. That's not for us to judge. But what we want to be able to do is build in a system that can support both of those issues, right? And be able to, if you're going to put $1 billion in the ground, we don't want to find out 10 years later that it wasn't the right solution. And so how do we build a system in a way that can be adaptable and flexible and ready for that next generation of learning?
Okay, so to jump on the last question, in thinking about long-term effects and putting money into the ground in efforts to try to make sure you're creating the best infrastructure as possible, have you been looking into like microplastics and the effects of leaching within groundwater, or some of the science behind that aspect of the materials being used?
Absolutely. That's been a big conversation of looking at projects. I know there's been a big movement to HDPE pipe because of that issue. I know looking at PVC early on. And so again, that's where we're working with people who we're pulling in expertise on these topics every time to think about what makes sense. And then, for example, this is a little bit different, but how our fish screens are typically built. Well, in Nevada, the way the soil composition is there, that would eat through the metal, right? So we're always looking at what is the longevity of the project and what makes sense from how pieces are structured. And at the end of the day, it just takes a lot of time, right? So when I was talking earlier about why do these projects not move forward, is because all of these questions are leading to so many considerations that you have to think about every time you're looking at these projects, whether it's groundwater versus surface water, whether the soils, what's the right pipe, all of these elements are coming into play.
Mm-hmm.
And we're learning more every day.
So what would be the workflow as you guys are looking at, or maybe even barriers, or how do you identify the next location of where projects will take place? And is it based on the irrigation system as itself? Is it based on geographic location? Like, how do you identify where the next projects will take place?
So traditionally, when we first started, there was a significant movement around focusing on fish screens only in a certain area because of a certain fish there, right? And totally made sense. The hard part about that was, you have, X number of projects you need, and then you narrow them down and you say to just this area, we'll put in screens. And then of that area, this amount of group is eligible, right? And then these people actually want to do the project and move forward, right? And so it's a really hard process sometimes to find the people who are able to move forward and those right locations. So in FCA, we shifted our strategy a bit to say, we want to work with people who are ready for modernization. There's so much need. In one space might be the fish as the driver, another might be groundwater as the driver, another place water quality. How do you prioritize those? And so we basically took the strategy of saying, we want to work with people who are motivated and excited and ready for this, right? Because it takes so much resources to be able to implement in the ground. So we're looking at communities where you have often a board that's managing these water systems. Is the board and the management, are they on pace with each other? Are they working well together? What's the community dynamic? Do they have strong community partnerships, whether it's with environmental groups or the tribes that all have a common vision towards modernization? And that's where this really starts picking up momentum, right? If that water delivery system's been identified by the county and the community and the environmental groups and the tribes, and everyone has come together to say, yes, this needs to happen. That's the sweet spot. And that's what we're really looking for.
Are there opportunities for private corporations to invest with projects? There's a lot of questions about funding and the process of seeking funding and looking at the project and where funding is falling short. Are there opportunities for private organizations to invest if the need is there?
You know, that conversation comes up a lot, and we get contacted by a lot of private investors, especially from the social impact space, right? Because they're trying to think about how to accelerate this work. And we've been really trying to figure out how to structure that. The challenge to the social impact space has been that there's a number of state and federal loans that you can get that are low interest and long term. And how do you beat a 2% loan at 30 years? It's hard to beat that. That said, as these other pieces are coming into play with renewable energy, you know, we thought in the beginning that private sector investment would really help the renewable energy projects. But the reality is the rates and the return on investment is so low. To be able to put them in the ground, we've got to have enough value to support the irrigation districts to be able to modernize their system. But that doesn't mean the door is closed. And, you know, we really think in this space of fiber optics and transmission and hydro, and that doesn't have to go with a pipe. That also, we're looking at canals. We're also looking at systems. Do we put solar above these open canals to help cool the water and kill off the algae? And there's so much creativity starting to happen when we think about this space of dynamic water systems that I expect there will be more opportunities coming for private investment than there are today, or have been so far, at least that I know.
Well, the facts that you shared at the beginning, the conservation or the efforts of, you know, looking at the percentage of water loss, you said 30 to 70%, and then looking at the age of the infrastructure of the systems, you know, we're dealing with wooden canals that are 75 to 100 years old. You know, those were the stats that you shared with us at the beginning. How many miles of pipes have you put in the ground thus far? I'm sorry to put you on the spot with this exact number, but can you recall that number so far?
So our number today, so our Irrigation Modernization Program is relatively young, and our first 7 districts are the ones that are in construction right now. I said 150 million earlier. I think we're closer to 170 million right now. I can't remember the number right now that's literally in construction today, because they're our first wave. And then the rest of, you know, the first 7, I feel like we're at somewhere in the 30 to 50 miles right now.
And my last question here that I'm going to pose to you, and this is coming from, you know, wearing the hat of the instructor, coming from the environmental sciences and policy and energy policy, climate division and GIS. For the next generation of graduate students that are coming from Johns Hopkins, our program, you know, you pose some wonderful advice, you know, for outside the box thinking, but what advice can you give our students that want to enter your industry? Where do you see the needs of folks with environmental sciences and policy and energy and all that? Perhaps give us some guiding wisdom to the next generation.
You know, obviously there's all the pieces like data collection and policy work and whatnot, but I find the real magic happens when people get on the ground and they start having conversations and learning more about people's needs. Mm-hmm. There's often been a disconnect when we first started working in this space, and I would say it's changing rapidly right now, where there's the assumption of, you know, east, west, urban versus rural, farmer versus environment. And yet when you get down on the ground and you really start working with someone, just because they're from a different party or a political background, there's still so much opportunity. So often people agree on the right solution, they call it something different. You know, in our, when we were starting on the fish screens, it took us a little while to realize, oh, this group's talking about a debris screen and they're talking about saving money. And this group is talking about a fish screen and they're saving fish, same screen. And I've seen this pattern over and over and over, and that these projects are a way to unify so many different people. And I see it so often. I'm listening to the news, and it's why I brought up of, you know, the grids in Texas or these power outages, or I think about, I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and thinking about the water systems there, or just thinking about the infrastructure of Detroit in general. It is such an opportunity, and I think most people don't think about infrastructure as a place to focus their energy on, or a catalyst for environmental benefit. And yet these pieces that we want, electric vehicles and recharging stations. Well, that's great. It works really well, living in a rural space, the cars are getting better. But, to buy an electric vehicle that has a 200-mile range, well, that's almost my drive to Portland and back. And so can you realistically get to a place and get your charging? Now, what if you want to drive that out to a rural area? Or what if the state wants to buy a fleet of electric vehicles, but they have to drive to the furthest corners of the state? Is it realistic? Well, not if the infrastructure is not right. And I think what's really exciting, even just thinking about the questions coming up today, right, where people are asking these questions, we're in a space where we have wooden canals. What's the right way to modernize? We're learning all the time. We want all that learning. And I think every time someone comes to the table with new ideas, that's a gift. And we think about it and we figure out what that path forward is and how do we go forward and how do we study that more and learn more. And so the biggest piece I find that when I'm talking to people that are thinking about the space is just thinking about having those conversations, trying to learn more about what it is people need, whether it's farmers in the field or it's thinking about drinking water systems and thinking about what else can be layered upon it and thinking creatively in that space. I mean, I think about the systems with hurricanes and they talk about how expensive it is to bury power lines. Well, what if every water municipal project in the country had to put a conduit pipe in every time? Would it cover everything? No, not at all. But it could get us there. It could start getting us there, right? And that whole conversation of just thinking about what do people need down the road, thinking about that. And then that's the other piece in FCA space. We spend a lot of time working on communications and thinking about the story. So often I would go meet with funders, in particular, a lot of the funding in San Francisco and Seattle. And people would say, we're interested in funding water. So that's great. There's so many water projects. Now this has changed, but this is from my early days. And I've seen this pattern replicate where people will say, well, we're looking at some urban farming watering pieces. And I'd say, okay, that's great. What about farming water? Well, we're not thinking about that. Those people don't want to do water projects. You don't hear that as much now, but you see it all the time. And then on the farms, people say, well, those people don't care about us, right? They're not interested. And yet, what's the one thing everyone wants? And especially today with COVID, they want to be able to sit at a table and have a conversation and learn about someone who's different than them, right? They really do want to, the funders really do want to have a chance to meet those farmers and learn about what they need. And the farmers also want to meet the agencies and the funders and the different groups so they get that point of connection. And that's where the innovation is. It's about the relationships. It's about communication. It's just about learning about each other.
I think you really hit the nail on the head here in talking about how water is the conduit to connect people, all different groups, and to keep the opportunity of communications open. And many comments coming in about how important communication is. And again, that you've just done a wonderful job. I want to thank you very much for speaking today. I know we could probably have this conversation for hours on end.
Thank you all for taking the time.